Welcome to Superhumanize, where we explore the edges of human potential and the systems, seen and unseen, that shape our lives. Today's conversation is a deeply personal and profoundly scientific journey. I'm honored to welcome Martha Carlin, citizen scientist, entrepreneur, systems thinker, and founder of BiotiQuest. When her husband John was diagnosed with Parkinson's in 2002, Martha didn't just become a caregiver. She became a force of research, uncovering unexpected connections between the gut microbiome, neurodegeneration, and the modern toxic landscape. In this conversation, we speak of grief and love, and also bacteria and frequency. We speak of supplements and also of synchronicity. We map systems from spreadsheets to stool samples and explore how shifting the internal terrain may be one of the most powerful levers for healing our minds and bodies. This episode is an invitation to listen not only with the mind, but with the gut.
Superhumanize. Accelerated evolution.
Martha, welcome to the Superhumanize podcast. What a pleasure to connect with you.
Thank you so much for having me today. I'm really excited to be with you.
Oh, me too. You are a woman of my own heart. You are what's called a citizen scientist, and we'll dive deeper into this a little further along in our conversation. You have put forth so much from knowledge, research, products, and I would actually like to open up this conversation about the flame that sparked it all, so to speak. Martha, when your husband was diagnosed with Parkinson's in 2002, you took a path that not many would take, becoming what I just mentioned, a citizen scientist and not just a caregiver. And your story resonated so much with me. I have had deep personal experience with Parkinson's as well. My father, who passed this year, he was battling Parkinson's for 15 years. And so I felt so moved when I learned about everything that you do, Martha. Could you take us back to the moment when you realized you would walk this path, not only beside John, your husband, but as a researcher and a system mapper?
Sure. So John was diagnosed in November of 2002, but I actually started noticing some changes in him earlier in that year. He had a very slight, like a tremor in his pinky. He had a tremor in his tongue. But the thing that I had noticed the most was he lost his facial expression. So then when I would look at him and he was looking back at me, his face was blank. And it's really hard to explain to people how that makes you feel when you can't see, like, the micro expressions that we have in our face that tell somebody that we love them or that we're upset, or you don't have those micro emotions showing on your face. And I had picked up Michael J. Fox's book. I think it was the first one was called Lucky Man, and was reading that, and I was seeing these little things with John that seemed to mirror some of what he described. And I asked him to go in for his physical and to tell the doctor about what was going on. And I'm not really sure that he gave all the information. And it's interesting because doctors only see you once a year if you're young and healthy. And he went through the whole physical, and I went with him to get the results because I had this feeling of what the doctor was going to say, and the doctor didn't say anything. And so at the end of the appointment, I said, what about the loss of facial expression and the tremor? And so I don't think John had mentioned those, and I could see the look on his face then. He said, I'm going to refer you to a neurologist. And then when we went to the neurologist, just walking back to the room, because John, one of his arms wasn't swinging, and that is often one of the easier ways that they diagnose, is if the arms aren't swinging. And the doctor looked at me and he said, "You know what I'm going to say, don't you?" And it was really devastating, I think, for both of us, especially for John. He didn't want anybody to know. But I came from a background of investigation. I was trained as an auditor. Never take anything at face value, examine the evidence yourself, map things out. How does a business work? And so I went home, and that was still early days of the internet, but I was within 24 hours looking up everything I could figure out. I was ordering books and trying to understand and map it out. So just from the very onset, I took it on as a problem with my systems background.
Yes.
And I just really never stopped from there. But my mother had multiple sclerosis. And so my father, when I told him John had Parkinson's, he was very sad and he said, "I don't wish this for you." And I said, "Who better than me? Because I know the path."
Yes. Yes, Martha. And it's so interesting how life sometimes comes together where before we're not able to connect the dots. But your background in business and systems thinking is actually part what makes your work so unique. And I'm curious, when you began to research Parkinson's, what patterns did you first begin to see, especially ones that maybe even surprised you?
Initially, I looked a lot at food because from my business background, we would map what was flowing through the business. And so I thought, okay, what's flowing through the body? That's food. So really for the first 10 years, I was looking at food and what we had done in the engineering of our food and the chemicals that were used on them, and really tried to move to a much cleaner diet. But really back then there wasn't a lot of organic choice. It was early in that stage of the food supply, but it improved over the years. So that wasn't so surprising as when I discovered the microbiome. So I had been looking for what I'll call the map of what's happening. And I read a book in 2014 by Dr. Martin Blazer called Missing Microbes, and had talked about the microbiome and growing up in the age of antibiotics, which we were really that first generation that grew up with antibiotics prescribed for everything. And it had also antibiotics had also progressively started to be used in animal husbandry and in the food supply in ways that I had no idea. And so this microbiome, I was like, what's that? What's the trillions of fungi, bacteria, and viruses that live in and on our body? And they function as our internal pharmacy. And the huge epiphany for me was that there's probably a ratio of about 2 cells microbial to every 1 cell human in our body. So we're like a giant petri dish. And so I started digging in to try to understand the microbiome. And later that year, Dr. Philip Schepperhans from Finland published the first microbiome paper, showing that you could divide the two phenotypes of Parkinson's. One has more tremor and the other has more freezing gait and posture issues. And you could divide that by the gut bacteria. And I was like, that's it. Like this thing called the microbiome, that's the general ledger of the body. And that's how I'm going to be able to tie all these pieces together. And so I quit what I was doing and I started funding some research at the University of Chicago, doing time series samples of my husband's and my microbiome and just digging in, trying to understand what are all these bacteria, what are they doing, how do you do genetic sequencing, what is that information? And slowly, later that year, I actually founded the BioCollective to build a platform, not just for Parkinson's, but because I started to see from that systems perspective that everybody was losing this function, and it was just presenting as different diseases, probably depending on other exposures or your genetics or a number of different factors, and I just felt like the microbiome could be a really important map for
Yeah.
people to understand that. And so that to me was just a huge surprise that there's this little map in our gut that can tell us so much about what we're exposed to, what we're dealing with, and how the body is trying to adapt. And
Yes, Martha. And you have called the microbiome the operating system of the body. And I would like to know from you, what are some of the most profound insights you've received in all these years that you've been studying this internal ecosystem?
one of the biggies, so going back to food and what we had done to the food, I had looked at the herbicide organophosphates. Glyphosate is the most well-known name, although a lot of people don't know that name. But many herbicides and insecticides are what are called organophosphates, and they target this pathway that it was approved by regulators because humans don't have that pathway. So in our genes and our metabolism, we don't have this thing called the shikimate pathway. But plants have it and bacteria have it. And in that pathway, like I have a book on that pathway. There are like 3,900 metabolites that are downstream of the top of that pathway if you look at a biochemistry map. And dopamine is one of those.
Oh, gosh.
Melanin is one of those. Thyroid hormones. So you start to look at many of the things that are synthesized by the cholesterol molecules and are involved in this pathway. And then there are 3 amino acids that we don't make in our body: phenylalanine, tryptophan, and tyrosine, that are only made by plants and bacteria. So we have to get them from a plant, or from an animal that eats that plant, or from bacteria in our gut that make them. And so that was also like a huge epiphany for me, and a way to tie what we've done in the food supply really back to all these different things that are going wrong in the body, where people don't necessarily see from a systems perspective. If they pulled all those things up to the top, like, where do they connect? They connect up here, where we're poisoning ourselves with a neurotoxin. And it's like people with Parkinson's, and the rise in Parkinson's is a pretty good indicator of this toxic burden from what we've done with organophosphates that are known. They're neurotoxins in insecticides. And I guess that's another kind of surprise, is that we're really not that different from insects.
No, and we are not an island. As you said, there's 2 microbial cells per human cell. We are an ecosystem. We are a system. We are a constellation of life. And we, coming from this mechanistic view of the world, this kind of a science model that was imposed on us, the old science model that is now slowly coming more in tune with what really is. But I remember my father was a huge fan of, the brand name is Roundup, the weed killers. And he was always so excited to spray stuff around the house. And that may not have been what brought on Parkinson's for him. There's a lot of other things that may have been a cause as well. Many streams of these insults, as they're called medically, to his system. And these invisible toxins, they have visible impacts. Your work has touched on the role of, you just spoke about it, glyphosate, but also sugar, stress, and even electromagnetic fields as disruptors of our microbial balance. So this is more of a theoretical scenario, of course, but if you could wave a magical wand, Martha, and change one thing about our collective exposure landscape, what would it be?
It would be the organophosphates.
Uh-huh.
A close second would be what we're doing with the electromagnetic fields. I think that the organophosphates, the neurotoxic poisoning of our entire environment, it's destructive to us, it's destructive to the animals, it's destructive all the way down to the bacteria in the soil that make our food nutritious. And so it just has so many implications. For me, that would be the one thing, if I could wave a wand, that I would get rid of.
And Martha, I'm curious, do you by any chance know the current numbers? How many billions of dollars of a market are these organophosphates?
I don't know the market size. I mean, I should know that off the top. I do know, I was talking to some scientists last week. In the US, it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 300 to 400 billion acres that are sprayed regularly with some form of an organophosphate. And
Big money.
yeah, and it's just the more you do it, the more toxic the load, the more problematic it is all the way down through the food chain.
Yeah. Yeah. And so the organophosphates are one thing. You mentioned the second would actually be how electromagnetic fields. Can you share more how this actually can disrupt microbial balance?
So there's actually a long history of looking at the effect of different frequencies on bacteria. I would say electromagnetic fields and light are exposure to what people don't think is something that would have that huge of an effect on us, because like we don't notice the difference in the light spectrum or the electromagnetic field. But as John actually later in his illness, he was very sensitive to electromagnetic fields. We moved out into the country to get away from the exposure to a lot of the 5G towers and things that were around us in Denver. And the blue light exposure, changing the light in our house. And what we would see is, just as an example, if he went to a Costco, and if we walked through the door of the Costco, they have these very bright LED lights. He couldn't walk in a Costco, but he could turn around and walk right out to the parking lot. That kind of exposure. And then we started to see the impact, because I track all these different things trying to figure out, is it body temperature? Is it what could it be? And we started to see a pattern with the Earth's electromagnetic field. So solar storms and things like that would actually make him worse. So depending on what the solar activity was. So if you, like, the Earth's magnetic field is one thing, but then when we start to overlay other artificial electromagnetic fields, those also have an impact, because the cells in our body and the microbes are picking up on these signals. And there's something called quorum sensing. They even send electrical signals to each other to say, okay, we're here. How many of us are here? And so that's also something that can get disrupted by these fields.
What is that called again? I'm not familiar with that term, Martha.
Quorum sensing. So if you think about, like, when you're taking a vote and you need a quorum, you need a certain number of people there. So they have different mechanisms for sensing that there's a quorum of their similar species, that then they will maybe switch on a different gene to do something different. When there's more of them or less of them, they might switch something off or switch something different on.
That makes great sense. And with regard to frequencies and light, of course, we also have the opposite. We have frequencies and light that can heal us, that can help us stay in homeostasis or return to it. And what comes to mind are individuals like Hulda Clark or Royal Raymond Rife, who were far advanced in what they studied, and also some of the treatments and devices they put forth. And I'm seeing a little bit of a resurgence of that now. Actually, not even a little bit. There's some major studies that have also been done. And I think, if I remember correctly, even with regard to cancer and how certain frequencies, it's fascinating. So I'm hopeful that this will become mainstream very soon. There's so many things we don't know, and it's just crystal clear that the way we're going about things, from agriculture, from industry, even from the conventional medicine, there's a lot of things that are just not good.
And things that we're missing. I
Yeah.
mean, there's, on the light side, we worked with a scientist at the University of Denver who had made a light cap for John with different light spectrum. And it was pretty amazing. Like, you could put the cap on and flip the switch for a certain spectrum of light, and his face would light up. And there is a company out of Australia called Symbix that is studying a light cap and a cap around the gut, basically, to send these light signals. That's more red light. And then there's some research out of MIT using a pulsed 40 hertz light in an animal model that showed it could reverse 50% of the plaque or the aggregates in the brain of I think a mouse or a rat in an hour, 1 hour. So it's like this pulsing signal. And so I think there's a lot we just don't understand about the shape shifting in our body and the different signals that make cells and bacteria and everything in the body do different things.
Yes. And different topic, but related to that, there's so much we don't understand. And I'm including myself here. For example, years ago, I did not realize how much diagnostic and also narrative power a stool sample holds and what the gut can reveal, especially in cases of chronic diseases or neurodegenerative illness that other tests like taking blood samples just miss. Can you go a little bit deeper on that, Martha?
So that was one of the first things that we started to do, was collect stool sample when I started the BioCollective. And a lot of the microbiome research, even now, uses a technology called 16S sequencing. So they're only sequencing one section of the bacterial genome, and that's where they can tell pretty closely based on that segment what species it is, but they don't know all the functions it has. And so when I started out, I knew there was something called whole genome sequencing, where you could sequence the whole, like, everything in there. So you would know not just the species that are there, but the genes that they have. So it would tell you functionally what capabilities they have. And so we started out there, and we were sending people this 60-page report that had all of the bacteria, all the viruses, all the fungi, and I say all, it's only what's in the databases. So there's a lot of what they call dark matter that they still haven't identified what it is. But we're getting all this information, and we have toxin genes. And so you can start to see different pieces of the puzzle. And over the course of 10 years of looking at this and looking at different companies that were doing reports like ours, people would take it to a doctor, and it's 60 pages long, and it just has all these different organisms and genes and things. And our medical system hasn't trained people to be able to understand what that means. So then I would be like pulling all this research and trying to help people. And I thought, okay, this is probably not the best way to go. So we've seen this evolution over the last 10 years of companies like Genova Diagnostics, which has, I think, a GI map. Microbiome Labs has a report. There's a company called Jonah now. There's probably maybe a dozen companies now, Viome, that look at different aspects. And each one of them, in the way they collect and process the sample, will have some kind of bias. So I always tell people, if they're going to do something like that, they should stick with the testing that they start with, because you can't compare something from Genova to, say, Viome. They're very different in their approach, but each one can definitely tell you some valuable information. And one of the things that I learned in looking at it was the toxin producing bacteria, and in particular, the endotoxin producers. And these are mostly your gram-negative bacteria. And over the course of digging through Parkinson's and looking at the different animal models, I actually found there were 500 papers using endotoxin to induce Parkinson's in a mouse. And I thought, okay, if you can make a mouse get Parkinson's like symptoms with endotoxin, why aren't you looking at endotoxin in people with Parkinson's and figuring out how to address that? Then I started to look like further into endotoxin, which is very inflammatory. And there's an endotoxin disease model for diabetes, for depression, for all of these different chronic diseases can be tied back in some way, many of them, not all of them, but many of them, to endotoxin, which, is back in our gut. And so a lot of these reports will give you an idea of whether or not you have some of these gram-negative bacteria. What they don't do, I think, is most of them don't point out this endotoxin connection or lipopolysaccharide. Those are interchangeable names. And so most people are not familiar with that term, but I think people should get familiar with that term because it's likely one of the big drivers of many of our chronic diseases.
Yes, and this is when I read about you and also about your husband, my father dealt with the same thing when he was diagnosed probably 15, 16 years ago, that you're basically told, oh, there's like nothing we can do, and here's the medication to manage the symptoms, but no one knew what to actually look for as what's the cause of this and how can we address this. And that's why your work, what you've been doing is also so vital, because these diagnoses we get, they don't need to be a death sentence or this is how it's going to be. No, we need to look at these things from different angles. And that being said, there's also toxins. The toxins we are exposed to or ingest are one thing. There's also a growing body of research on how different type of toxins, perhaps how emotions and trauma affect the gut microbiome. What have you seen or learned with regard to this particular aspect, Martha? Do you believe that maybe the gut holds a memory beyond the biological?
Yes. And that's actually been an even bigger learning for me in the last 2 years. I've been working on a little docu-series with another group called Resolve Parkinson's, and we're interviewing people with Parkinson's to tell their story because, like, our medical systems today are very reductionist and focused on single things. And so there's rarely this tell me your story so that I can try to figure out maybe what factors were involved. But if you actually sit down with a person with Parkinson's, which I've done many times over 23 years, but really with the focus of this documentary, asking them, so many of them had a major life stress event, loss of a parent, loss of a child, a traumatic accident, or some of them a lifetime of trauma, traumatic relationships. And even in the process of trying to understand stress and its impact on the gut and the brain are very connected, and stress is a big driver there. I came to the realization myself that I'm a type A person. I'm trying to solve the problem, but that's also very stressful. And I recognized that I was creating stress for John in my pursuit of the answers and trying to make everything perfect. And so I started to change my own behavior to reduce his level of stress. And then I started to recognize in many of not everyone, but in a lot of Parkinson's couples, I would see a very strong type A wife who was often speaking for the husband. So we started in our documentary sometimes when we would do the interview with both husband and wife, is that we would ask a question and the wife would answer, and we would have to say, let's let so-and-so answer. And so that's a whole nother layer that I don't think anybody is really looking at in Parkinson's. But just back to those traumatic events or grief often held in the body. I think there are a lot of therapies, somatic release, emotional freedom technique, many different ways to address some of that. But I've also started to think about like ancestral memory in the body, because you see, my husband's family came from Ireland, and there's a whole long history of trauma to the Irish people, or Parkinson's is more prevalent in Ashkenazi Jewish people, and there's a whole long trauma pattern in that. So I would really love to see somebody look into those dynamics and try to understand how we could help connect that and get people the resources to help release some of that. But the other, just back to how that impacts the gut. And when we get in a closed off, whether it's closed off from grief or from trauma or an accident or anything like that, the body starts to hold things.
Yeah.
And there's a pattern in people with Parkinson's often, not all of them, but probably 80% have had a long-term history of chronic constipation. You're fearful, you hold, and then you don't go to the bathroom, then you have more toxins in the body. So the body's got it, so it gets this sort of cycle going. And if we could start to understand that and get people, oh, I need to clear my body of waste, whether it's physical waste or emotional waste, I think we could turn back people who might have gotten Parkinson's otherwise from ever getting it.
This all makes so much sense, Martha. And I've mentioned it quite a few times in this podcast. My dad, he was born 1935 in Germany. He was 10 years old when the Second World War ended. So as a little boy, he grew up in this crazy world that the adults at that time put on him. And then he went through the Hunger Years. And so many of his generation, he never, ever processed the trauma. It was just because at the time also, I mean, it was truly generational where people just shoved everything under the rug, kept functioning, survival mode, and things were never talked about again. And he also had a tendency to hold on to things, also physically. There was this very, I guess, when you grow up during such a formative time, and you probably learn that the natural way you react emotionally to dysfunctional events doesn't get you anywhere. So my father, I think he was a very logical, rational man who was not very much connected to his emotions, because that was likely what he learned, that it was safer for him and it didn't get him anywhere anyways. And so, yes, I think to support people releasing, there's this great book by Bessel van der Kolk, The Body Keeps the Score. These things, they stick in our tissues. So that's a really important aspect. And I'm with you there, Martha. I hope somebody will look into this more deeply and connect the dots.
We're hoping that once we get the series of interviews out, that it will become clearer to, I don't know if clinicians will look at it, but even if they could start to think about that and even refer somebody to, and quite frankly, a Parkinson's diagnosis in and of itself is pretty traumatic. So that to me ought to be a part of the care model. I know in the Netherlands, they have a very holistic, comprehensive care model, and they have much better outcomes, better quality of life for a longer period of time, because they're looking at the whole person and addressing this emotional piece of it.
And I think that's such a hugely important area, the emotions, the spirit, to circle back to the body. Something else that is so often connected with many chronic illnesses seems to be mitochondrial dysfunction. And I would like to know, have you seen any connections between gut health and mitochondrial resilience or dysfunction during the course of your research?
Part of what I've looked at, mitochondria are evolutionary relatives of bacteria. So I think there's definitely communication from the metabolic output of the microbiome to the mitochondria. And mitochondria are in Parkinson's are under a very high level of oxidative stress. And some of that oxidative stress is coming from the microbiome. Some of it, I think, is also underappreciated. You talked about how your father was there for the hunger years, is the inability to uptake nutrients. So we get the lining of our gut gets damaged, and we're not able to take up nutrients appropriately. And so even though you're eating, you're nutritionally deficient in a lot of micronutrients. And that also ties to the organophosphates that bind those micronutrients up. But the mitochondria, they need copper, a small amount of copper, but that copper runs the mitochondrial respiratory chain. And so when you start not being able to properly digest your food and the microbiome can't get enough nutrition for itself and to break down the food and supply it to you, then the mitochondria also suffer. And then there's mitochondria either swell or they split off and try to make more. And that's one of the research areas, I think, where they've seen fasting. In fasting, I think you get mitochondria that make more mitochondria, and as opposed to the ones that are swelling and trying to deal with the load in other ways. And so I think in Parkinson's, there's a researcher, Michael Phillips in Australia, who's been looking at intermittent fasting and a ketogenic diet in Parkinson's as a way to reset the metabolic health and address what's going on in the mitochondria. But also light has a lot of impact on the mitochondria. So there's quite a few people looking at what the different light spectrum does to the mitochondria, and the red light therapy also helps with that. And back to John using the red light cap, and you can definitely see a difference.
Yes, I'm a big fan of red light therapy. We have an infrared sauna at our home in Los Angeles, and I love it. I can feel the difference when I use it regular versus not using it. And there's a lot of science behind that as well. Talking about metabolic health, and one of the really fascinating aspects of your journey is how it led to the development of actually a line of probiotics. And one particular product of yours is really so interesting to me. It's called Sugar Shift, and it's a patented probiotic. And it's, correct me here where I'm wrong, it's designed to convert excess glucose and fructose into mannitol, which is a compound that has high antioxidant properties. Can you walk us through how you actually got to develop the formula and what the benefits of it are? Some anecdotes from people who have taken it, some studies perhaps?
Sure. So the idea actually came from the World Parkinson's Congress in Portland, Oregon in 2016. Over the years, John would have sort of ups and downs, and he was in a down patch at that point, and he was walking with a cane and not able to navigate the crowd well. And I went to a group from Israel that was called Clinic Crowd. They're a little difficult to find now, but it was a citizen science group who was bringing the research of a scientist who had looked at mannitol, which is a sugar alcohol, had shown in animal models that it could stop the aggregation of the proteins that are a hallmark of Parkinson's called alpha-synuclein, and it could also pull them out of the brain and clear them. And I was like, wow, okay, I have to go investigate this molecule. And so I came back from the meeting and I found this little mannitol book. And I mean, it's an incredible molecule. It's used in a lot of aspects of medicine for brain trauma. If there's swelling in the brain, it's used for drug delivery, and it's a free radical scavenger. And so in looking at the book, I saw there was a chapter in there that there are some bacteria that could actually make mannitol from other sugars. And I was like, oh, so we could put a factory back in the body that could make this, because we get so much glucose and fructose in our diet, then we could restore, like fermented foods. You're going to make a kind of a team that works together. And so I had a friend who was a fermentation chemist who had spent 20 years in the probiotics industry. And I sat down with him and said, Steve, here's what I want to do, and here's what I think we need to have in it. And he was able, through all of his relationships in the industry, to help us make this just a little prototype batch of 100 bottles. And I went to the meeting in September. We had the bottles in December, and John started to take them. And within 30 days, he was no longer walking with a cane. He was able to navigate through a crowd, and we were testing his microbiome, and we could see, compared to all those other ones we had done, that it was moving back closer and closer to the healthy human microbiome. And so then we just started like giving out samples to people, and they were like, oh, I feel so much better. Or somebody who had constipation, it fixed their constipation. And we went along for about 2 years like that. And then we decided maybe we'll take this concept of putting a team together and develop other ways of putting teams of probiotic organisms together. And Dr. Raul Cano was my chief scientific officer, and he had spent about 35 years at Cal Poly as a microbial ecologist, and he really understood how microbes work together in teams. And so we spent a month just mapping out on our whiteboard, what are all these problems people have, whether it's stress or their immune system needs support or cardiovascular health or hot flashes and so we mapped out these like 25 different things and how could we put teams together. And we had also built a computational model where we could basically run this huge computer simulation to see how they would work together. And we put all these teams together and then used our simulation and tweaked those. And eventually in late 2021, early 2022, we brought some of the products to market, and Sugar Shift was one of those. And people started reporting improvement in blood sugar and better sleep and better energy and so we started to look deeper at all the different mechanisms of how it worked. And it was supporting mitochondrial health. It was supporting the production of bacteria make melatonin. So bacterial melatonin was helping with sleep. And we went on to do a clinical trial. And first, I wanted to do a clinical trial in Parkinson's, but it's a complex illness. It's multifactorial, and there aren't any good like blood measurements or kind of endpoint measurements. Most of them are subjective. It's called the UPDR score, which every doctor kind of scores differently. So we decided to do it in diabetes because we knew the product was altering the metabolic profile in the gut. And I think it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 to 40% of people with Parkinson's have insulin dysregulation. And of course, we also knew this endotoxin connection in a diabetes model and in a Parkinson's model. So we did a clinical trial in a diabetes cohort, and over the course of the trial, the endotoxin dropped significantly in the blood serum endotoxin, but also in the microbiome markers. So all of the microbiome markers went down too, so those agreed. And then the blood sugar compared to the controls, both fasting blood sugar and postprandial improved, triglycerides improved. And then we didn't get a change in HbA1c at the 90-day mark. And then we unblinded and kept 10 of the subjects on for another 90 days. And then they did get about a 14% drop in HbA1c. And that's a marker that really takes longer. Yeah. We could start to really see in the microbiome a lot of the shifts that were going on that explained why it was so beneficial to energy and sleep and all of these other factors beyond. But the endotoxin to me is the real key, because what it did was it restored the gut to an anaerobic environment. And if you think about it, it's inside your body, it's not supposed to have oxygen. And when it has oxygen, it attracts the wrong kind of bacteria. So we basically restored the gut to an anaerobic environment as it should be. And then that lets some of the key species like bifidobacteria, that's very important to our long-term brain health, come back and flourish. And it was exciting to see those results.
Those are phenomenal results, Martha. And I personally am not dealing, knock on wood, with any chronic disease, but this sounds to me like something I definitely want to be taking. So I'll be trying it in the very near future. And I have probably at least 4 to 5 friends who have quite severe GI issues. So I'll have them put it on their radar screen. Before we hit record, Martha, you shared with me about a new product you have. Peace. Tell me more about this, because that really intrigued me. You just came off a travel day, and you said, I was just like, wow. I asked you first, are you still up for doing this interview? I'm totally fine to switch gears, do it another day. But you were just like, vibrant, no, let's do it. And you said, actually, this new product of mine I think it really helped me today. So tell us more about that.
So yes, it's called Perfect Peace, and it's one of the ones we designed initially in that exercise we went through. And we were thinking about, okay, how do we make a microbial team that will help us deal with stress and anxiety? And so it's a team of microbes with some amino acids that sort of kickstart them. But what it does is it supports GABA, which keeps us calm. And so we did a small batch of it, and my son took it, and he has a heart rate, or he has something called a Whoop that tracks his stress and heart rate variability and stuff. And the first time he took it, he was like, wow, it just like his stress stuff was going like this. And he took it, and within 30 minutes, it was just even Steven. And I took it with me on my trip, and I was coming back from San Diego, and yesterday was probably one of the most stressful and long flight days. But I decided when I got on the plane, I thought, I'm going to take 2 Perfect Peace. I took it. I was just very relaxed the whole day. And we spent time flying around Chicago for who knows how long. Landed in Indianapolis, then got back on the plane, then flew back to Chicago, round and around. Anyway, I finally got to a hotel right about midnight, and then had to get up at 4:00 for a flight that then got pushed again 2 hours. And so I took it again this morning, and I just feel calm and rested. And so I'm like, okay, it works from my perspective. And another friend of someone that works with us also had a similar flight problem earlier in the week. And or I guess it was early last week, and he had sent a note that, hey, I took that Perfect Peace, and I was so chill through all the flight stress. So I think we have plenty of stress factors now. So I think we've come out with that at the perfect time.
Yes. And for our audience, you said you'd be so kind and look into a special pricing or coupon for the audience. So we will put that in the show notes. But where can our audience find these products?
They can find them on our website at BiotiQuest.com, and that's BiotiQuest.com. They're also on Amazon, but the code I'll give you will only work on our website. And obviously, we'd rather you buy it from us, but
absolutely.
But you can go to Amazon.
Super. And if there was one thing, Martha, that you would like for the audience to take from this conversation today, what would it be? Or is there perhaps something you haven't shared yet that you still have on your heart and would like to share?
Despite the fact that I lost John last year to a pulmonary embolism, I have not given up my search for answers, and am still continuing, and really feel like we're getting so close. So I want people to have hope. And the other thing I want people to know is you can transform yourself into anything. You know, from an accountant to a super duper microbiome scientist digging down into very complex details. If you are motivated, you can teach yourself anything.
Beautiful. I love that, Martha. And as a closing reflection, we are not separate from the systems we inhabit, not from the soil, not from the microbes, not from the grief or the trauma that alters our chemistry, or the love that shapes our questions and our quest. Today, we heard a story not only of science, but in a certain sense also of surrender, a story where loss became a compass and where cracking sugar became a trail toward light. And the gut often remembers things the mind forgets. And sometimes healing does not begin with an answer, but actually with a promise, with a vow to keep asking. And I hope that this conversation will remind you, you are not a collection of symptoms, you are a living ecosystem. And every small shift, every brave act of attention, of acknowledgement, echoes across the whole. This is Superhumanize. Until next time, stay curious, stay connected, and keep listening to the signals within. Martha, I'm so grateful you came onto the show today and shared your time, your wisdom, your purpose, and all the wonderful thing you're putting forth. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Ariane. That was really nice.
Superhumanize. Accelerated evolution.